There are some letters you wish you'd never sent, and some you pray someone else will answer for you. In the winter of 1889, a woman named Eleanor Mayfield boarded a stagecoach out of desperation, not love. A mail-order bride with pressed gloves and a hopeful heart, she was chasing the promise of a better life. What she found, however, was a man she hadn't expected. They called him Big Tom Callahan, a rancher with a belly that hung over his belt and a voice like distant thunder. He was twice her age and 3 times the size of any man she'd known. And though he smiled kindly and offered her a home with real walls and warm bread, Eleanor froze. She saw only what the world had told her to fear. She left before sunset, left without looking back. But what happened next wasn't bitterness or revenge. It was her younger sister Clara, quiet, round-faced, and never the favorite, who found the letter Eleanor had thrown into the fire. Half burned, half saved, and somehow fully hers. Clara had always known what it felt like to be second. Second in beauty, second in charm, second in affection. But for once, she decided not to ask permission. She boarded that same coach, headed to the same ranch, and stood in Eleanor's place at the edge of the Callahan estate, nervous, yes, but with her own hopes tucked into her satchel like a hand-sewn handkerchief. What Big Tom did when he opened the door that morning would surprise you. But what Clara found inside that home between silence and soil-bred dough and brokenness might just restore your faith in what love can look like when no one's performing and no one's pretending. This isn't the story you think it is. This is not about the prettier sister, not about regret. This is about the woman left behind who learned that sometimes stepping into someone else's place can help you finally belong in your own. So if you've ever wondered whether life still holds something beautiful for you, even after rejection, even after being told you're too plain too old or too much, this story might just be the one your heart's been waiting for. Because out here on the quiet edges of the Wild West, where the wind doesn't care how you look, sometimes the love that lasts begins where you were least wanted. Stay with us to hear what Clara finds behind that door. Because sometimes the one who wasn't chosen ends up becoming the whole world. In the quiet town of Flat Willow, Montana, the wind moved slower than the years. And for Hattie Carver, age 50 and twice betrayed, it felt like time had given up on her altogether. She wasn't always this way. There had been a moment, a sliver in the past, where she had dared to hope. It had come in the form of a letter, ink, smudged, trembling handwriting, responding to a mail-order ad from a rancher named Silas Boon. He was described as large, gruff, and widowed, and he was lonely. In that letter, Hattie had poured out pieces of herself. She rarely showed anyone her love of quilting, her stubbornness in the face of prairie storms, her fear of dying unseen. But Hattie never sent it. Instead, it was her younger sister Ruthie who had intercepted the letter, and with a giggle and a toss of her sun-kissed curls, rewritten it with her own name at the bottom. "He'll never know the difference," Ruthie had said with that careless tone beautiful girls often have. "Besides, you're not really the marrying kind, are you?" Those words had sliced deeper than she'd let on. Hattie wasn't ugly, but time had made her face wise before it made it lovely. She was large-boned, strong-armed from years of lifting sick children in her days as a nurse, and quiet in a world that rewarded noise. In their youth, she had shielded Ruthie from their drunken father and paid for her schooling with her own wages. But in this, Ruthie had stepped in and taken something Hattie didn't even know she still longed for. Silas Boon had married Ruthie, or so Hattie thought. She hadn't seen her sister since. Life after that felt more like weather than living. Hattie moved through seasons with little change, caring for others in town, refusing more proposals than she ever expected, always from the wrong sort. She stayed with their aging mother in a home that creaked with memories and buried herself in the routine of service, hot soup, folded linens, mended socks. There was dignity and quiet usefulness, but not much light. And then one morning a rider came to town with news. Ruthie was dead, and the Boon estate, a once thriving ranch high in the hills, had all but fallen apart. The rider, a thin boy with tired eyes, handed Hattie a note in her sister's handwriting. It was crumpled, stained, and unfinished, but unmistakably Ruthie's. "If anything happens, tell Silas the truth. Tell him it was Hattie he wrote to first." The wind changed that afternoon, and for the first time in 20 years, Hattie packed a bag. Some truths wait decades to be spoken. But what will Silas do when he learns who the letter was truly from, and who now stands at his door? The journey to the Boon estate wound through narrow switchbacks and steep hills dusted with old snow. Hattie Carver hadn't left Flat Willow in almost 2 decades, and each turn of the trail was like peeling back the layers of someone she used to be before duty hardened her, before rejection told her what love wasn't. She didn't ride fast. Her old gray mare Mercy took the mountain trail steady. It gave Hattie time to rehearse the words she might say to Silas Boon, though none ever seemed enough. What would a man do when he found out the bride he thought he married had tricked him, when the letters he cherished came from a different hand, a different heart, and would he even remember the name Hattie Carver? By the time she reached the Boone gate, dusk had spread like ink across the hills. The once proud fence was leaning. The barn, long unused, looked as though it wept from the eyes of its windows. And the house itself, grand once, had shutters that hung limp like a man's shoulders after too much grief. She dismounted bone stiff, walked slowly, each footfall a prayer. And then the door creaked open. He stood in the frame, broader than she recalled from the photograph, in the ad, but older too. Weather-beaten. The kind of tired that doesn't sleep off. His beard was silver-trimmed short, his eyes gray as river stone, fixed on her without recognition. "Can I help you, ma'am?" he said. "Ma'am." That word clanged harder than it should have. "I'm Hattie Carver," she managed. "I came because Ruthie asked me to," before she passed. A flicker passed his face. Pain, confusion, then something softer. He opened the door wider. "She wrote to you, she did, and she left something unfinished. I thought you had a right to know." He stepped aside, silently inviting her in. Inside, the house smelled of pine ash and worn leather. Simple, sparse. A man's space kept tidy but unloved. She sat where he gestured, an old wooden chair by the fire, and waited for the trembling in her chest to settle. He poured coffee, strong, no sugar. "I didn't know Ruthie had family left," he said, still standing. "She never spoke of you." "She wouldn't have," Hattie replied. "But I was the one who answered your ad, Mr. Boone. She took my place, without telling either of us." He didn't flinch. He just stared at the fire. A long moment passed. "I always thought she sounded different in person," he said at last. "The letters, they felt like someone else. Gentler, wiser. I tried to love her, but it never matched what I read. Silence hung thick, neither cruel nor kind, just honest." "Did she ever know?" he asked. Hattie shook her head. "Not fully. I think she guessed near the end. But what matters now is she wanted you to know that the words you cherished weren't a lie. They were just from the wrong sister." Silas finally sat, and in that quiet moment, two strangers who should have been familiar, something unspoken began to shift. But will a truth delayed still have the power to heal, or has too much time passed for love to begin again? The following days passed in a hush that was not quite peace, but not quite discomfort either. Hattie stayed in the old guest room, Ruthie's room. Nothing had changed. Her sister's hairbrush still sat beside the cracked mirror. A worn shawl draped over the bedpost, stiff with dust and memory. Hattie folded her hands in her lap that first night and whispered, "I'm here now, Ruth. I did what you asked. But what am I to do next?" Silas Boone was not a man of many words. He went about his work on the ranch with quiet purpose. Fenced a portion of land, repaired a squeaky barn hinge, fixed a broken stovepipe. But there was something behind his silence, not hostility, not even sorrow. Just a waiting, as if he too didn't yet know what to do with the truth that had arrived on his porch. One afternoon, as Hattie sat peeling potatoes by the kitchen window, she heard his boots approach the doorway. "You wrote about hawks," he said quietly. "In the letters, you said they were the loneliest kind of bird. But you admired them." She turned surprised. "I did." "You wrote that they don't need applause to fly." Her throat tightened. "I still believe that." He nodded, then returned outside. It was moments like that, half-formed unspoken, that began to stir things inside Hattie she hadn't let herself feel in years. Not hope, not yet, but maybe warmth, the kind you don't trust right away. Still, guilt curled inside her chest like smoke. She watched Silas from the window that evening, stacking logs near the shed. He moved slowly, a slight limp in his left leg she hadn't noticed before. and she thought about all the ways life had made them both heavy, her with shame and weariness, him with losses unnamed. She wanted to tell him she didn't come here to stay, that she'd meant to hand over the truth and leave, that love at her age felt like a door she'd long closed. But then why had she packed her nicest shawl? Why had she braided her hair that morning? The truth was, Hattie had come with no plan, just a heart full of ache and a hope so small she dared not name it. One evening, as they sat by the fire, Silas finally asked, "Why didn't you come sooner?" She stared into the flames. "Because I was told I was too old, too plain, too late. And after a while you start to believe that, and settle for letters instead of life." His gaze was steady but gentle. "I believed every word of those letters. I was afraid they'd be the only parts of me anyone ever loved." The fire cracked, soft as breath. Then he said they weren't. And just like that, Hattie felt something shift in the room, a silence no longer shaped by sorrow but by closeness. A heart that has known silence for too long will tremble when it's finally heard. But can Hattie allow herself to believe she's worthy of being loved in the full weight of who she is now? Not just then. The next morning, Hattie awoke before the sun. The house was still. A low fog curled over the pasture outside, softening the outlines of the fence posts and making the world feel quiet, almost holy. She dressed in silence and wandered to the small cemetery behind the house, the one she'd seen from the kitchen window, but had not dared approach. 3 crosses stood in the frost-hardened ground. One bore the name Ruthie Mae Hollowell Boon. The date carved beneath it struck Hattie like a slow fist to the chest 3 months ago. The marriage hadn't lasted long. She knelt in the brittle grass, her hand brushing the carved wood. "She was always braver than me," she whispered. Behind her, she heard a crunch of boots. Silas stood a few paces back, hat in hand, his eyes soft with understanding. "She didn't make it through the winter," he said. "Fever took her, fast and cruel." Hattie nodded. She always hated the cold. They stood there in the hush, not speaking. Something passed between them that didn't need words, a grief they both carried shaped differently, but made of the same sorrow. Back inside, Silas poured coffee into 2 mismatched mugs. They sat across from each other at the table, like 2 people still trying to find the edges of a map they were meant to share. Hattie traced the rim of her cup and finally asked the question she'd held back too long. "Do you resent me for coming in her place?" Silas looked up slowly. "No," he said. "I grieve her, but I don't blame you. You didn't take her from me." "Life did." She nodded, a tear catching in her lashes. But another question itched beneath her skin, the one she couldn't ask without cracking open the shame she still carried. "Do you pity me?" He blinked. "What kind of man do you think I am?" She didn't answer, but she did look him in the eye for the first time without flinching. "You're not Ruthie," he continued, "and I don't expect you to be. But you wrote those letters. You showed me your mind, your heart. I know who you are." She smiled barely. "Who is that woman who's lived? A woman who still knows kindness. A woman who wants to be known." Those words stayed with her all day, echoed in her when she stood alone hanging laundry on the line, the wind tugging at her sleeves. A woman who wants to be known. But the shame clung to her shoulders like wet wool. When she walked to the general store the next afternoon, one of the younger wives whispered behind a gloved hand, "She's the one who showed up after her sister died. The one with the jowls." Another woman added with a tight smile, "Better to die than be replaced, I say." Hattie turned away, face burning. Her hands trembled as she walked back down the dirt road, clutching the sack of beans and flour against her chest like armor. That night she didn't come to the supper table. She lit a candle in Ruthie's old room and sat beside the window watching the moon rise. She had come to start again. But could she? Could a woman be wanted when the world had already labeled her leftover? And yet, Silas had not looked away. What happens when shame is louder than truth and ghosts of the past whisper louder than hope? Can Hattie truly believe she is not a shadow of what could have been, but the beginning of what still might be? The storm rolled in fast that evening, thunder cracking like bones splintering in the sky. Rain whipped sideways against the windows of the Boon homestead, rattling the shutters like some ghost demanding to be let in. Hattie sat curled in a quilt near the fire, her knitting forgotten in her lap, hands clenched tight in the fabric. Down the hall, Silas moved through the kitchen with slow, measured care, making supper for two, though he hadn't heard her footsteps on the wood floor in hours. But still he cooked. He always did. Something about that steadiness made Hattie ache. She wanted to believe this was home, that she belonged. But the echo of the townsfolk's whispers still clung to her ribs like damp cotton. Better to die than be replaced. That line had gutted her more than she'd admitted, because hadn't she once believed it herself, that a woman her age, soft-bodied, sun-lined, and far too slow with her words wasn't someone men chose, but someone they settled for. She wasn't blind. She had read the shock on Silas's face the day he met her, the subtle pause in his throat, the shadow that had passed across his eyes when he realized Ruthie was not coming, that he had signed up for someone else and received her instead. It didn't matter how kind he was, how patient, how gentle with his words. Hattie couldn't shake the question. Was she someone worth staying for, or just someone he was too decent to send away? The storm outside roared louder. It matched the one growing inside her. She stood abruptly and walked to the kitchen barefoot, the hem of her dress brushing the floor. Silas looked up startled. A question flickered across his face, but he said nothing. I think I should leave, she said quietly. He blinked. Leave? I can go to Widow Elkins's boarding house. She mentioned needing help with the laundry. I don't want to be a burden or an echo. Silas set down the spoon in his hand, slowly, deliberately. He walked over to her, not hurried, not dramatic, just there as he always was. You think I'm keeping you out of pity? She swallowed. Her silence was answer enough. Silas looked away for a moment, as if gathering his words like scattered cattle in the rain. My late wife, he began, was fierce, loud. She challenged me in everything, even where to plant the carrots. I loved her for it. But loving her doesn't mean I can't see you. Hattie frowned, confused. See me, I see the woman who gets up before sunrise to mend what she didn't tear, who hums while she churns, who looks tired but still tends the hens, who sets a place for me at supper, even on the days I come in sopping wet and silent. He paused, and I know what this town thinks. I hear 'em too. But I don't take my truth from their mouths. I take it from what I see. Hattie's throat tightened. Her hands trembled at her sides. I don't want you to stay out of obligation, Silas. I don't want you to stay out of fear, he countered gently. And in that quiet, something cracked, not a painful break, but a soft fracture like spring thaw splitting frozen ground, letting in something warmer. Outside, the rain slowed. Inside, so did her heartbeat. But fear, like winter, doesn't melt in a single hour. Will Hattie take a step toward the warmth, or retreat to the cold safety of solitude once more? Is healing still possible when doubt has rooted deep inside a woman's bones? The morning after the storm, the world outside looked washed clean, wet soil, dark and fragrant, the sun tentative through the thinning mist as if unsure it was welcome. Hattie stood by the window, a mug of tea warming her fingers, watching a pair of sparrows hopping along the fence rail. Their feathers were scruffy, damp, but they carried on anyway, chirping, building, surviving. So much of her life had been about endurance, doing what was expected, being quiet when it hurt, swallowing shame like bitter medicine. And now there was something else growing beside that hurt. Something tender, something unfamiliar. The night before had left her raw. Silas's words hadn't been poetic. They weren't rehearsed, but they had been real. And they had pierced deeper than flattery ever could. I see you. She'd stood alone so long she forgot what it felt like to be truly seen and not judged, not fixed, just seen. But could she believe it? She heard him in the kitchen again, humming low under his breath as he chopped carrots, probably still in the wrong row, but that no longer mattered. She walked slowly toward the kitchen, heart tapping like a timid knock. He turned as she entered. There's coffee too, he offered gently. I made a decision, she said. He paused, waiting. I'm not leaving. Not today. Not tomorrow. Not unless you ask me to. Silas blinked once, then nodded, just once, steady. I wasn't going to. Hattie moved to the table and sat. Her fingers trembled as she pulled a spoon toward her. It's not easy. Choosing to believe someone wants you, not out of duty, but because they do. Silas sat across from her. That's true for both of us. A silence settled between them, but it was a good kind, like the hush that follows a hymn where nothing more needs saying. Later that afternoon, Silas asked if she wanted to ride out to the creek with him. She hadn't ridden a horse in years, and when she admitted it, he simply offered his hand and said, "We'll go slow." And they did. They rode under the wide Wyoming sky, the land still soaked but alive. The wind tugged at her hair, and she let it for once, not worried how she looked. By the water they stopped. Silas helped her down and they sat by the bank boots in the soft grass. "I was always told I'd miss my window," she murmured. "What window to be loved?" He smiled gently. "Some folks spend their lives standing in front of the wrong window. Doesn't mean the house ain't full of warmth." She laughed, really laughed, and the sound surprised even her. It felt like something long buried being unearthed. Not flashy, not dramatic, just whole. For the first time in years, she wasn't trying to fit into a place that didn't want her. She was already here, and it was enough. But in a town still quick to whisper and slow to understand what would come next, would the world outside their door allow this quiet love to last or test it with eyes that never soften? The townsfolk of Willow Ridge didn't know what to make of it at first. Hattie Granger, the spinster who never left, was suddenly seen beside Silas Boon at the supply store, her hand resting calmly in the crook of his arm. No dramatic pronouncement, no wedding veil, just there, present, as though she'd always belonged and folks had only now begun to notice. Some whispered, of course they did, about her age, her looks, about the fact she took another woman's place, about how a widower like Silas could have done better. But Silas never flinched. And Hattie, though her cheeks still flushed when the stares lingered, too long began to feel something sturdier growing inside her than shame. It wasn't pride exactly, it was peace. He taught her how to hold a rifle. She taught him how to hem curtains without turning them into crooked sails. He still burned the biscuits. She still snorted when she laughed. And neither of them minded anymore. When they built a small greenhouse out back, just a few planks, glass panes, and salvaged window frames, they filled it with basil, rosemary, and bright purple petunias. Folks passing by began calling it the kindness house, and it stuck. One spring morning, a young girl from town came asking Hattie for help. She was 17, scared, and carrying a child no one wanted her to have. Hattie made tea, listened, held her hand. Silas showed up with a blanket and a cot for the spare room. And just like that, their home became more than shelter, it became refuge. They were never flashy, never the loudest at Sunday service. But week by week, people stopped talking about them and started talking to them. One elder said, "I didn't know a love like that could bloom this late." Hattie simply smiled. "It didn't bloom late. It just took time to grow roots." Silas added, "And once it did, it held." On the porch that evening, as the sun dipped low and the wind brushed through the wheat, they sat side by side in quiet. Not much needed saying. Hattie reached over, fingers threading through his. "I used to think being seen meant being beautiful." Silas kissed the top of her hand. "You are." No one applauded. No one threw rice. But in that hush of dusk, where wildflowers bowed in the breeze and every star waited to blink into view, there was a stillness that said you made it. A love not loud but lasting. A home not grand but real. And a woman once discarded, now quietly cherished for all of who she was. In the end, it wasn't Eleanor's beauty that healed Big Tom's loneliness. It was Clara's quiet courage. It was her soft presence in a house once filled with silence. Her hands gently tending to a garden others overlooked. And it was the way Tom looked at her, not as a replacement, but as a revelation. She had been called too much, too big, too invisible all her life. Yet in Tom's eyes, she was exactly enough. This story isn't about revenge or second chances snatched from others. It's about how love doesn't always arrive in pretty packages or perfect timing. Sometimes it comes wrapped in humility, kindness, and the gentle choosing of one another day by day. If you've ever felt passed over, unwanted, or unseen, may Clara's story remind you that your worth isn't tied to who chooses you first. Sometimes being chosen last makes the love deeper, truer, and more tender. And maybe, just maybe, there's still a place being made for you somewhere out there. If this story touched your heart, we invite you to subscribe to None. Wild West Saga for more healing tales of quiet love and lasting dignity. Leave us a comment. Would you like to see what happened after Clara and Tom's first winter together? Or do you want more stories like this of unexpected love on the frontier? Don't forget to like, share, and help these stories find someone who needs them tonight. We're so glad you're here.